A man wasn't meant to see something like this. A police officer tied to a wooden post, gasoline gleaming beneath his boots, and a flame waiting for its chance to kill. Whoever planned it didn't fear witnesses, because they didn't intend to leave any alive. And in that stolen moment between one heartbeat and the next, a quiet veteran and his old shepherd stepped out of the trees and saw the truth Ember Creek had buried for 5 long years. The kind of truth that ruins men. The kind that burns towns from the inside out. If you stay with me for just one more minute, I'll tell you exactly why that officer was left to die, and why the fire wasn't the worst part of this story. But before we begin, tell me how you're feeling right now, and where you're watching from today. Wishing you a peaceful day ahead. Even as this story walks straight into the flames, morning in Ember Creek carried the kind of quiet that settled into a man's bones. The kind carved not by peace but by years of surviving storms. It was early enough that the frost still clung to fence rails, turning them silver beneath the soft Montana sun. The small town was waking slowly, a distant truck engine coughing to life, a porch light flicking off near the general store, the smell of wood smoke drifting from one stubborn chimney that never seemed to sleep. Out on the back roads, however, the world felt untouched, all cold light and whispering pine and breath that fogged gently in the air. Raymond Cole guided his dusty pickup along those roads with the ease of someone who had spent half his life drifting between silence and duty. 55 years old, tall, shoulders still square beneath the weight of old memories, he looked like a man cut from the same stubborn material as the mountains themselves. His face was lined but steady, sun-chiseled, with eyes that had once been sharp enough to catch danger in a crowd, but now preferred to watch the slow unfurling of morning across the ridges. His flannel jacket hung open, exposing a faded gray t-shirt, and his gloved hands rested loose on the wheel, driving without hurry. Beside him sat Max, once a service K9, now retired yet unmistakably alert. The German shepherd was large for his age, nearly 9, with a thick sable black coat broken by a silver streak along his muzzle. Max sat upright, one ear forward, one tilted back in that familiar lopsided posture that always made him look as if he were listening to 2 worlds at once. A faint scar cut across the fur behind his right shoulder, a quiet trace of the life he and Raymond had lived. A life that left no medals but plenty of stories. His nose twitched at every draft coming through the window, picking up pine, frost, and something else he hadn't yet named. They weren't heading anywhere specific. Raymond just liked to chase the kind of quiet he understood, quiet that wasn't empty, but waiting. Sometimes Max nudged his elbow with that insistence only old dogs possess, urging him toward the forest roads where the wind still carried the smell of who he used to be. Raymond always listened, though he never said so aloud. The forest thickened as they turned down the narrow gravel road. Sunlight speared through the trees in long, golden beams that flickered across Max's fur. The silence deepened, settling heavy in the cab. That was when Max's posture shifted. The shepherd's head lifted sharply, nostrils flaring, one ear pricked. A low, rolling rumble built in his chest, faint at first, then unmistakable. Raymond's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, though he already trusted the answer. Max didn't take his eyes off the woods. A thin, unnatural ribbon of smoke drifted above the tree line, darker than chimney smoke, rising in sluggish curls that spoke of something smoldering rather than burning clean. Smoke like that had purpose. Smoke like that belonged to fear. The veteran slowed to a stop beside an old wire fence. His boots crunched through the frost as he stepped out, the breath lifting white from his mouth. The forest greeted him with a hush so profound it felt conscious, watching. Max leapt from the cab with quiet precision, nose pressed to the ground, tail stiff, not fearful, but ready. They crossed through the gap in the fence and entered the trees. The deeper they walked, the more Raymond felt the air shift. The usual scent of pine was still there, but beneath it lay something sharper, the bitter sting of gasoline soaked into the cold soil. Max moved ahead, weaving between trunks, pausing only to look back and ensure Raymond followed. He didn't bark. Max rarely barked when danger was close. He simply led. The smoke thickened, the forest opened, and the clearing appeared. It was a small circle stripped bare of grass, ringed by high pines whose branches leaned inward like witnesses. At the center stood a wooden post, roughly cut, darkened by sap and old weather. Tied to it, head slumped, uniform torn, was a man in his early 30s. Brown hair matted with blood, cheek bruised violet. His badge glinted faintly beneath soot-streaked fabric. His boots rested atop a pile of dry branches, all slick with gasoline that shimmered in the pale light, like an oil slick waiting for its spark. Officer Ethan Cole. Raymond didn't know him personally, but the name slammed into him like a struck bell. Ethan Cole, the officer mentioned years ago in an investigation whose echoes still haunted the county. A report, a fire, a boy who died, and blame that never settled comfortably. But there was no time for memory, not with what waited at the base of that post. Kneeling on the ground was a man in his early 50s, gaunt and pale beneath a hooded jacket ripped at both elbows. His beard was untrimmed, salt and pepper, clinging to sharp cheekbones hollowed by exhaustion. His hands, gloved but torn, cupped a metal lighter. His eyes, pale blue and rimmed red, were fixed not on Ethan, but on the flame he was trying to shield from the wind. Eyes so empty they no longer saw a man tied to that post, only a burning. Raymond's breath stalled. The lighter clicked. The flame sputtered to life. Max moved first. The shepherd exploded from the tree line, silent until the last instant. Then a surge of snarling fury as he slammed into the stranger. The man fell sideways, the lighter flying from his grip, skittering across the dirt. Max's jaws clamped around the man's forearm, teeth sinking through the fabric with a force born from training and loyalty. Blood seeped through the glove as the stranger screamed through clenched teeth. Raymond lunged, reaching the lighter just as it paused at the edge of the gasoline. He slapped his hand over it, feeling a searing sting as heat scorched the skin beneath his palm. The gasoline shifted, pooling closer, but no flame caught. Not yet. Max held on until the stranger's strength faltered and panic overtook rage. With a desperate wrench, he tore himself free, leaving a scrap of glove and blood in Max's teeth. He stumbled backward, boots scraping the dirt, eyes wild yet calculating. Then he bolted into the trees, crashing through undergrowth and leaving a trail of dark droplets behind him. Raymond didn't chase. Max didn't either. The dog stood over the lighter, chest heaving, fur bristled, the growl still vibrating low in his throat. The clearing felt suddenly larger, colder. The smoke curled thin upward, and beneath it, Ethan Cole drew a shallow breath, so faint Raymond nearly missed it. He moved to the officer, fingers working at the ropes. Ethan's skin was ice cold, sweat and soot mixing along his jaw. The knots were brutal, designed not to restrain, but to punish. Raymond's hands trembled slightly as he worked, not from fear, but from the sickening realization that this wasn't a crime of impulse. Someone had planned this. Someone had watched Ethan suffer. Behind him, Max circled once, sniffing the air, then positioned himself at Raymond's back, guarding, always guarding. The first siren reached them as a thin wail in the distance, weaving through the trees like a ghost. Raymond didn't look toward it. He kept working at the knots until his fingers brushed the edge of Ethan's badge, half hidden beneath the torn fabric. It read, Ethan Cole. Raymond's breath froze. A name from a past he thought he'd outlived. A forgotten report that once tore a town in two. And suddenly he understood. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a reopening. A memory stepping out of the fire. A truth refusing to stay buried. And what waited beyond these trees was far older than the smoke still clinging to the air. The sirens grew louder. Max lifted his head, ears forward. Raymond stared at Ethan's name, a cold recognition settling deep in his bones. The past, it seemed, had finally come looking. By noon, the forest no longer felt like a place for quiet men and their old dogs. It had become a breathing machine of uniforms, radio static, and hurried boots slicing through damp undergrowth. Raymond stood at the edge of the clearing with his arms wrapped in fresh gauze, watching medics slide Ethan Cole's battered body onto a stretcher. The young officer's chest rising in those uneven, stubborn breaths that made survival look like a bargain struck at the last possible second. Max sat pressed against Raymond's leg, head low, ears flicking toward every sound. He didn't trust the sudden rush of voices any more than his master did. A helicopter thumped in the distance, stirring the treetops, but the clearing held its own heavy silence, as if the woods themselves were bracing for what would come next. Even the smoke seemed to hang around longer than usual, reluctant to drift away. Lieutenant Dean Harper emerged from between the trees like someone who had walked through more than just underbrush. He was around 50, broad-shouldered, African-American, with a calm, square face marked by soot streaks that hadn't fully dried on his uniform. His dark hair was trimmed tight, but a silver line ran through one temple like a scar time chose to leave visible. He carried himself with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who learned long ago that panic only feeds fire. When his eyes met Raymond's, neither man nodded, but something old and wordless passed between them. Recognition, grief, duty, all braided into one quiet moment. Dean stepped closer, boots sinking into the soft, ash-tinged soil. "He's lucky," he murmured, glancing at the stretcher as medics lifted it toward the waiting ATV. His voice had that steady timbre of someone who had delivered too many updates to too many families. Raymond didn't answer. The question already burning in him felt like an ember trapped behind his ribs. Max shifted his weight forward, watching Dean with the thoughtful stillness only shepherds possess. Finally, Raymond let the words fall. "Who'd want a cop burned alive?" Dean exhaled, long and slow, as though the air itself resisted being released. His eyes roamed the clearing, the gasoline ring, the trampled dirt, the broken branches marking a desperate struggle, but he didn't speak. Not yet. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was calculation. Something measured behind his gaze, like he was waiting for the world to say something first. Thunder rolled faintly beyond the hills, the kind of distant growl that hinted at storms crawling across Montana's spine. Hours later, the responders thinned out, swallowed one by one into trucks and radio chatter. Raymond left only when the forest began reclaiming its own shape, shadows stitching themselves back between the trunks. He returned to town as the sky dulled into the sickly gold that always precedes rain. Max rested his head on the truck's open window, catching scents from every gust of Incoming wind, smoke long cooled, fear long dried, something old trying to rise again. By nightfall, when Raymond stepped into the small motel room he had rented for the week, the air carried that electric heaviness before a storm. The lamp on the nightstand flickered once, then steadied. Max padded in behind him, claws tapping the wooden floor in a nervous rhythm that betrayed what his stoic face did not. Raymond lowered himself into the single chair by the table, reached for the towel, and gently wiped the dried blood from Max's muzzle. The shepherd held still, but his eyes kept darting toward the door, pupils wide, muscles tight beneath his coat. Old instincts never faded. They only learned new shapes. "You can smell the past, can't you, boy?" Raymond whispered, thumb brushing the tuft of fur beneath Max's right ear. The dog blinked, slow and thoughtful. That look he always gave when he understood more than a dog should. Outside, the first raindrops tapped against the metal railing, each one falling with the promise of a long night. It was then the reports began to roll in, first as rumors, then as whispers, then as a name: Ralph Denton. The motel television crackled with local news flashes. A forestry engineer once respected for his meticulous work on wildfire lines. A man who had once mapped safety zones across Montana's forests, like he was drawing lifelines for strangers he'd never meet. 5 years ago, he lost his son in a cabin fire so intense, the investigators said the supporting beams melted. 5 years ago, the case went cold. And 5 years ago, the rookie assigned to the final report was Ethan Cole. Raymond sat still, hands clasped, the towel forgotten on the table. The memory flickered in him like the end of a match. An old headline, an older argument, voices rising in the town hall, a grieving father shouting that someone needed to pay. It had faded over time, pushed aside as the world moved on, but grief never forgets its own shape. Max lay down beside him, pressing his weight into Raymond's boot, a grounding presence. Dean called within the hour. His voice was low, nearly swallowed by static. "Ralph's name came up more than once," he said. "Old neighbors, former co-workers. No one's seen him in months. But someone matching his build bought lighter fluid and rope up at Miller's Supply 2 nights ago." A pause, long enough for both men to remember the look on Ralph Denton's face during that town hall meeting 5 years prior. A man broken unevenly, shattered in some places, dangerously sharp in others. Behind the pause came the unspoken question. If this was vengeance, how far would he take it? Raymond stared at the motel window, watching lightning fork across the sky, its reflection trembling on the glass like a warning. Max lifted his head, ears pricking toward the sound of distant thunder. The motel room hummed with the hollow echo of emptiness. 1 chair, 1 bed, 1 lamp, and 2 lives suspended somewhere between past duty and present danger. Outside, a car splashed through a puddle, then faded down the lonely road. Inside, Raymond felt something tightening in him, something he thought he had buried with the uniform he folded away years ago. The phone rang again. This time, Dean's voice held no pauses, no hesitations. "Raymond, we've got a second fire," he said, breath clipped. "Northern Trail. Small blaze now, but spreading fast. No campers registered there. It doesn't look accidental." Raymond rose before the words fully settled, his chair scraping against the floor. Max jumped to his feet beside him, tail stiff, stance ready. The storm outside cracked open in a burst of white light, illuminating the room for a heartbeat. And in that flash, Raymond felt it. The shift inside his chest. The familiar weight he hadn't allowed himself to name in years. Duty. It was coming back for him, carried by smoke and old grief. And the night was far from over. Dean's voice tightened through the phone. "The blaze is fresh, Ray. Someone struck again, and it's only the beginning." The line went quiet, leaving only the sound of thunder rolling toward Ember Creek. Morning arrived as a dull smear of gray across Ember Creek, the sky carrying the color of smoke long before any true fire touched it. The air felt heavier than the hour deserved, as though the night had whispered too many warnings for the dawn to clear away. Raymond stepped out of the motel room with Max at his heel, the shepherd alert, his coat brushing lightly against Raymond's leg. The moment the truck door opened, Max lifted his head into the breeze, nostrils flaring as if he could taste the shift in the world. Raymond didn't need words. He felt it too, an unease that clung to the ribs. They joined Dean Harper's convoy on the road leading toward the ridge, the patrol cars moving in a steady line, lights off but tension high. The tires crunched over gravel, echoing through the stillness that stretched above them like a held breath. The forest rose darker and denser as they climbed, pines leaning inward as though bowing over a secret they'd guarded too long. Halfway up the trail, Max let out a sound that froze Raymond mid-step. Not fear, not uncertainty, but an urgent whine pulled from the instinct of a creature who knew danger by scent rather than sight. Raymond dropped into a crouch beside him. "Where is it, boy?" he murmured, watching Max's gaze trace something invisible across the ash-marked earth. Dean stopped behind them, hand resting on the butt of his holstered sidearm. Wind swept through the burned pines, carrying the faint stench of fuel that had not come from any responder's equipment. Then Raymond saw it, a set of boot prints emerging from the blackened soil, sharp at first, then uneven, one dragging slightly, as if the man who made them limped or carried a weight heavier than his own body. Between the prints were droplets, dark, tacky, crimson that hadn't fully dried. Blood, not splattered, but trailing with intention. Raymond's breath tightened. Ralph Denton had been here, and he was hurt, or worse, beyond caring about pain. The search party moved deeper into the trees. Birds were silent. The wind carried no freshness. Every step felt like crossing into the hollow left behind by a grief that refused to rot. A half-buried gas canister lay near a charred stump, still warm when Dean touched it with the back of his glove. The metal throbbed faintly against the cold air, as if holding a pulse of its own. Max circled it twice before sitting down, posture stiff, eyes locked on something beyond the immediate clearing. Raymond knelt, using his unbandaged hand to brush away the loose soil around the canister. Something white caught the light, a folded sheet. He pulled it free, shaking off dirt. It was a map, one of Ember Ridge, worn at the creases as if opened and refolded 100 times. Red circles marked the campgrounds, power lines, and maintenance shacks along the northern slope. Every circle was a place where fire could spread fast and emergency access was thin. Raymond felt the weight of it settle like a stone in his chest. Ralph wasn't hunting Ethan anymore. He wasn't chasing blame. He was preparing a burn pattern, one that could erase the town that hadn't given him answers. Dean crouched beside him, jaw set. "He's mapping a purge," he said quietly. Raymond nodded once. The truth tasted like ash. Ralph Denton had become the kind of man who believed fire could cleanse what the world had ruined. They collected the evidence and made their way down the ridge. The station buzzed beneath the fluorescent lights when they entered, officers moving with the jittery energy of people who had already felt the heat of the first fire and feared the promise of more. Ethan Cole sat in a small room at the back, still bruised, a thin bandage around his forehead, his uniform replaced by a gray shirt that made him look younger and more breakable. When he lifted his eyes and saw Raymond and Dean enter, something steadied in his gaze. Not defiance, not denial, but a weary resolve. Dean remained standing. Raymond leaned against the wall. Max lay at his feet, but his eyes stayed open, sharp as flint. Ethan drew a breath that trembled at the edges. "I made a mistake," he said, voice low but even. He didn't blink away guilt or look to the floor for escape. His words came like a man who had rehearsed them in silence for years, carrying their weight alone until it carved hollows into him. Raymond watched him closely. Mistakes were not foreign to him. He had lived long enough to know how they stuck to a soul. Ethan continued. "In the Denton cabin fire, I misread the ignition sequence. I thought it started near the fuse box." He rubbed his hands together, the motion small and almost prayer-like. "But it didn't. It started near the window. That means—" He paused. The truth forced itself out. "That means the boy couldn't have started it." Dean's jaw tightened. "So your report blamed the son." Ethan nodded, the movement slow, weighted. "I was fresh from the academy. I thought I was right. When the autopsy came back, I realized it didn't match. The pattern didn't match, but the file was sealed. They told me it was closed, that there was no reason to reopen it." His voice sank. By then, Ralph Denton had already disappeared. The room settled into a heavy quiet. Raymond felt an old ache stir in him, the ache that came from knowing one single error, made too young or too proud, could reshape a man's whole life. Ethan looked up, eyes raw but steady. "I tried to fix it," he whispered, "but I was too late." Raymond didn't speak. There was nothing he could say that would soften the truth. But he understood. More than most, he understood the shape of regret. Max growled softly, a warning, not at Ethan, but at the world beyond. His ears pricked toward the window. Raymond followed his gaze. Outside, in the dark line of trees beyond the parking lot, something pulsed, an orange flicker too low and too deliberate to be sunlight. One spark, then another, like a whisper rising in the timberline. Dean moved first, stepping to the glass. "No," he breathed. "Not again." Raymond straightened, the pounding of his heart matching the sudden trembling of the window pane as warm air drifted in. Fire was crawling up the slope, small for now, but hungry. And hunger was the one thing Ralph Denton seemed to have left. Raymond reached down and tightened Max's harness, his movements deliberate, controlled. The shepherd stood ready, muscles shifting beneath his coat, gaze locked on the rising glow outside. Raymond's voice came quiet but carved from resolve. "Not this town," he murmured. "Not tonight." And with that vow hanging in the air, the blaze answered back with a roar. Raymond and Max step toward the door as the fire begins its climb. A war of grief and flame has returned to Ember Creek, and this time, it's coming for everyone. Night didn't settle gently over Ember Creek. It dropped fast, like a curtain pulled down by a shaking hand. The air thickened with the metallic bite of approaching rain, and the treetops swayed in a slow, uneasy rhythm that warned more than they soothed. Raymond moved along the gravel road above Ember Ridge Campground. Max pressed close at his side, the shepherd's breath a quiet, steady pulse in the dark. Down below, lanterns flickered among tents. Families laughed around small campfires, unaware that the forest smelled wrong, too sharp, too bitter, like a match struck somewhere out of sight. Max stopped first, his muscles coiled beneath his coat, fur rising along his spine in a wave that told Raymond everything he needed to know. Danger wasn't coming. It was already here. Raymond followed Max's gaze toward the black seam where forest swallowed starlight. Something shifted behind the pines. A silhouette moved, unsteady but deliberate, limping with the weight of every step. Raymond stepped forward, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. "Max," he murmured, voice low. "Easy." But Max was no longer looking for reassurance. He had locked onto the figure emerging from the shadows. The man stepped into a sliver of moonlight. Ralph Denton. He looked like a ghost carved from ash. Gaunt cheeks hollowed by grief, graying beard untrimmed, eyes sunken so deep they reflected no light at all. His jacket hung crooked across a frame that had once carried a sun on its shoulders. Now it carried nothing but years of unanswered questions. A thin line of dried blood traced down his left leg from the wound inflicted somewhere along the ridge. His right hand shook, but the lighter he held stayed steady, as if it were the only thing he still trusted not to abandon him. Raymond lifted a hand. "Ralph," he called, voice steady despite the churn in his chest. "Don't do this." Ralph turned slowly, like a man pulling himself back from another world. When he finally met Raymond's gaze, his eyes were hollow, a kind of empty that didn't come from madness, but from a sorrow so deep it left no room for sanity. "You protect men who lie," he rasped, each word climbing from a throat scraped raw by smoke and grief. "But fire tells the truth." Moonlight caught the lighter as Ralph raised it, not toward Raymond, but toward the mound of leaves at his feet. Raymond saw it in the same instant Max did. Gas canisters buried beneath the debris. Ralph flicked the lighter. Max lunged. The world shrank to one violent collision. Man and dog hitting the dirt in a tangle of limbs, leaves exploding into the air. Ralph's shout breaking the stillness. The lighter slipped from his grasp, flipping end over end, a tiny blade of flame slicing through the darkness. It flashed once, bright as a firefly. Then it dropped. It landed inches from the dark sheen of spilled gasoline seeping from one of the punctured cans. Raymond hurled himself forward, the impact jarring every bone as he crashed onto the forest floor. Without hesitation, he ripped off his jacket and smothered the lighter, trapping the spark beneath a layer of cloth and desperation. Heat bloomed instantly. The jacket caught, edges curling into flame. Raymond slapped the burning fabric into the earth, grinding ashes beneath his palm until nothing glowed. The explosion never came. Silence fell as sharply as the danger had risen. Max stood over Ralph, teeth bared but controlled, every muscle taut, breath steaming in the cold air. Ralph lay on his back, panting, eyes wild, not with anger, but with something far older and more brittle: despair. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. The campground laughter below drifted up like a memory from a world Ralph no longer believed existed. The trees whispered overhead. The stars watched without blinking. Then Ralph pushed up on his elbows. Max growled, a low, rolling warning that rumbled through the dirt. Raymond reached a hand out, palm open. "Ralph," he said again, voice softer this time, not pleading, not threatening, just a man speaking to another whose soul had been set on fire long before tonight. "It doesn't have to end like this." Ralph stared at him, breath trembling, his face folded inward, grief twisting features that once belonged to a father, a husband, a man who went to bed believing the world was safe. What stared back now was a silhouette made of loss. "You're too late," he whispered. "You were all too late." Before Raymond could move, Before Max could shift, Ralph staggered to his feet, quick despite the limp, and disappeared into the trees. His retreating steps snapped branches, scattered leaves, then faded, swallowed by a forest that had grown too used to keeping his secrets. Max lurched forward, ready to pursue, but Raymond pressed a hand to the dog's shoulder. "No," he murmured. "Not yet." Max obeyed, but his eyes shone with restless fire, his breath rising in visible clouds. The clearing fell still once more. Then Raymond smelled it, the faint spiraling rise of smoke drifting upward from the path Ralph had taken. Not from the canisters, from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. A thin column rose into the sky, black against the scatter of stars, bending slightly with the wind before steadying into a vertical scar across the night. A signal. A message. A man who had nothing left to lose doesn't hide his fire. He announces it. Raymond stood, brushing dirt from his hands. His jacket lay smoldering on the ground, half burned, but the flame beneath it was dead. Max stepped closer, brushing his muzzle against Raymond's hip, grounding him in the moment even as the night around them shifted. The radio at Raymond's belt crackled. Dean Harper's voice cut through the static, breathless, urgent. "Raymond, he's not done. He's heading for the dam." The world seemed to tilt. The dam. The water. Supply. The families below. Ember Creek itself. Raymond looked toward the forest, where the smoke column wavered like a dark finger pointing toward the next strike. This night was far from finished, and Ralph Denton's grief was far from spent. Dawn rose slow as a wounded beast, its first light pressing through the fog in heavy red strokes that made the world look half born from fire and half drowned in memory. The air was cold enough to bite, and the wind carried that faint metallic scent of a night that had ended too soon. Raymond moved along the dirt road above Ember Creek, with Max glued to his heel, the shepherd's tail low, shoulders tight, nose cutting through the air, like a compass spun by instinct rather than direction. Dean Harper walked ahead, boots sinking into frost-hardened soil, while Ethan Cole limped behind them, one hand pressed against his bandaged ribs, jaw set in a way that said pain would not be the thing stopping him today. A gray veil lingered over the valley, hiding the sleeping town as if the world was trying to spare it from what the men were walking toward. The dam loomed above them, old concrete cracked by decades of winters, rusted railings, and faded paint peeled back to reveal the bones of the structure beneath. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way mountains are beautiful, yet in that moment it held a kind of tragic grace. A guardian with one good arm left, holding back a lake that glimmered crimson in the half-light. Raymond breathed deep and felt the weight of the place settle on him, the sense that the day had decided to bleed before anything truly began. Max pulled ahead suddenly, ears pricking, muscles rippling beneath his sable coat. He dipped his head, sniffing the ground where the gravel darkened the faintest shade. Diesel. Fresh. Sharp. A warning written for anyone who knew how to read danger in the earth. Raymond crouched, brushing 2 fingers against the damp grit, and when the smell hit him clearly, something cold threaded down his spine. Max continued following the trail, nose weaving between patches of wet soil, small rocks, and frayed pieces of cable half buried under leaves. "They're wired," Dean muttered, running a hand over the short gray stubble on his jaw. His voice was low, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the ridge above them, where shadows moved like old ghosts waiting to be named. "He's setting up a chain." Ethan swallowed hard, breath unsteady but determined. "He means to ignite from the spillway." If the diesel goes up there, the whole damn valley will burn. The men split without another word. Dean climbed toward the ridge, his silhouette swallowed by pines before he reached the second bend. Ethan took the long route around the dam, limping toward the control shed, a small structure with a tin roof and dust-covered windows that reflected the red morning, as though already on fire. Raymond followed Max toward the spillway, each step echoing hollow across the concrete walkway above the water. The spillway stretched below them, massive steel gates locked tight, slick with condensation, shivering with the rising wind. Max paused at the far end, where the railing dipped, his nose pressed to the cold metal. A thin line of diesel dripped over the edge, trailing into darkness. Raymond heard it before he saw it. A faint voice, low, cracked, whispering to someone who wasn't there. Max stepped forward, and there he was. Ralph Denton knelt near the central mechanism of the spillway, shoulders hunched as if trying to shield the broken machine from the dawn itself. His gray hair clung to his face, wet from fog or sweat or grief. Raymond couldn't tell. His coat sagged off him like a burden grown heavier with every breath. He held the lighter cupped in both hands, the tiny flame trembling as if afraid of the man who held it. But Ralph's eyes weren't on the lighter. They were fixed on something in front of him, something only he could see. "Now he'll rest," Ralph murmured, his voice threaded with exhaustion and certainty. "Now. Finally." Raymond stepped forward, empty hands raised, boots scraping lightly on the stone so Ralph would hear him and not startle. "Ralph," he said, his voice a low tremor that matched the wind. "You can't bring peace by burning what's left of it." Ralph turned, those eyes, wet, hollow, shimmering with the reflection of a sun long gone, met Raymond's. And in that look was no triumph, no gloating madness, only the bruised conviction of a father who had once believed the world to be good. "Peace died 5 years ago," he whispered. The lighter slipped. It happened in a way that felt both slow and brutally fast, gravity catching the metal, the flame wobbling in the air, the faint sound of steel tapping steel. Raymond inhaled sharply, but Max was there before panic could even take shape. The shepherd leapt, powerful legs propelling him across the stone, jaws snapping around Ralph's wrist with precision born of a lifetime in service. Man and dog crashed to the ground in a violent tangle, Ralph crying out, Max holding tight but not breaking bone, only stopping the hand that carried destruction. The lighter bounced twice, skittered across the spillway floor. It rolled toward the fumes, then veered, then dropped harmlessly into the shallow runoff water below. Raymond exhaled so hard his lungs burned. Ethan appeared first, pain etched across his face but fueled by something stronger, atonement, perhaps. He slapped the cuffs around Ralph's wrists, locking them with a sharp, metallic click that echoed across the still valley. Dean reached the spillway seconds later, knife already out, cutting through the fuse line Ralph had laced across the lower rail. The cable fell limp as a dead snake. The dam held. The valley breathed. The town, still wrapped in the soft blindness of early morning, lived on without ever knowing how close it had drifted to becoming a memory carved into smoke. Ralph sagged to his knees, cuffed, shoulders collapsing inward. There was no rage left in him, no defiance, not even fear. Just a hollow quiet, the kind that comes only after a storm has wrung a man dry of any remaining grief. Ethan hesitated before moving closer. Raymond watched him, saw the tremor in his hands, the way his jaw tightened with something more than pain. Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out a thin folder sealed with a red stamp. He knelt beside Ralph, the morning light bathing both men in shades of pale gold. "I fixed it," Ethan said softly, not as an officer, but as a man standing in front of the consequence of his own mistake. He opened the folder, revealing a report. Pages crisp, signatures fresh, truth restored. "The real ignition sequence. The real cause. Your son's name is cleared." Ralph stared, hands trembling around the papers as if they were made of glass. His lips parted, but no words came out. Not anger, not relief, just a single breath that hitched somewhere between a sob and a prayer. And then he wept. Silent, shuddering, broken not by rage this time, but by the weight finally being lifted from a wound too deep for light to reach until now. Sunlight spilled over the ridge. The valley opened its eyes, and for the first time in 5 long years, Ralph Denton did not look like a man trying to start a fire. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of one. Morning slid gently over Ember Creek, not in a blaze of gold, but in a soft wash of silver light, the kind that seems to forgive the roofs it touches. Dew clung to the tall grass, bending each blade with a quiet shimmer, and the distant hum of the river returned. Steady, familiar, almost shy after weeks of carrying the echo of fear. Raymond walked the dirt road leading toward the town square, his boots brushing against the stones that had warmed and cooled under countless days before this one, his breath forming thin clouds that vanished as soon as they appeared. Beside him, Max trotted with the unhurried stride of a dog who knew the valley had woken safe, ears flicking left and right, as if greeting old friends in the breeze. The square was already stirring. People moved slowly, not from reluctance, but from the sweetness of having time again, time not borrowed from danger or dread. Tables were set out with trays of cinnamon rolls still steaming in the air. Children chased one another across the lawn wet with dew, and the old flag above the courthouse swayed in a modest, grateful arc. Ember Creek had smelled of smoke for too long. Today it smelled of pine, warm bread, and the shy promise of rain. Raymond paused at the edge of the gathering, the worn flannel on his shoulders carrying faint traces of yesterday's soot, now softened by the morning light. Max stopped too, sitting at his side as though sensing that something was about to settle into place. Near the center of the crowd stood Ethan, his uniform crisp again, his posture straight but free of the weight that had bent it for months. His shoulder, once torn and bruised, held firm beneath the blue fabric, though it was the look in his eyes that revealed what had truly healed. There was no fear of judgment left, only resolve. Dean stood beside him, broad frame relaxed, the faintest smile hidden inside the lines at the corners of his eyes as he scanned the town he had nearly lost. Raymond felt a quiet tug in his chest, gratitude not loud nor showy, but deep in the way old oaks hold the earth. When Raymond stepped forward, the people parted with a soft murmur, and Max followed. His gait steady, tail low but wagging once, just once, in acknowledgement of the small sea of faces turning toward him. The mayor, a man in his late 60s with white hair pulled neatly behind his ears and a vest smelling faintly of cedar, held a small wooden box. His hands trembled, not with age alone, but with the kind of pride people rarely get to feel on such peaceful mornings. "Raymond," the mayor said quietly, offering the box, "whenever you're ready." Raymond nodded. He knelt on one knee before Max, placing the box on the ground. His fingers worked slowly, moving not with ceremony, but with tenderness earned from years of understanding this dog more deeply than he had understood many people. He lifted the collar. Leather dyed a warm chestnut tone, edges hand-stitched, and a brass nameplate that caught the morning sun in a soft gleam. Guardian of Ember Creek. Max raised his head willingly, almost solemnly, as though he sensed something bigger than the collar itself. Raymond fastened it gently, then rested a hand on Max's chest, feeling the familiar rise and fall of breath, steady as a promise. The crowd erupted into applause that felt more like an exhale than a celebration, a sound carried not by noise but by relief, pride, and the collective understanding that healing is not the absence of fire, but the life that returns after it. Raymond didn't bask in the applause. Instead, he watched Max, who lifted his head toward the forest, ears tilting in two different directions, as though listening for a memory carried by wind. Raymond sensed it too, the faint echo of sirens now replaced by birdsong, the spaces where fear once lived now filled with something gentler, quieter, something worth protecting even when no one was watching. As the crowd surrounded Ethan to congratulate him, Raymond stepped back, content to become a quiet observer once more. A child tugged on his sleeve, offering Max a small biscuit wrapped in wax paper. Another kneeled to stroke the dog's shoulder. Max accepted both with the calm dignity of someone who had seen fire, but now chose peace. Raymond slipped his hands into his coat pockets and breathed in deeply. Rain on the horizon, pine drifting in the air, and a warmth not from the sun, but from knowing there was nothing left in the valley waiting to burn. By late afternoon, most of the square had emptied. People returned to their chores, their porches, their long-missed routines. Dean walked past Raymond with a nod that carried entire conversations inside it. Ethan stopped beside him, lifting his cap in a gesture of respect before heading toward the station where paperwork and new beginnings waited in equal measure. Raymond watched him go, the young man's steps steadier than they'd been in months, carrying a future he had nearly forfeited, but now walked toward freely. The sun was lowering when Raymond reached his cabin. The valley unfurled below him, fields open and green, the river's surface calm like glass, the roofs of Ember Creek blushing in the late-day glow. Fireflies began to rise one by one, their small bodies blinking like tiny prayers sent upward in gratitude. Max settled at his feet on the porch, circling once before lying down, exhaling a long, contented breath that matched the quiet settling over the valley. Raymond leaned back in his old wooden chair, fingers grazing the armrest that had seen more winters than he cared to count. The sky dimmed, taking on hues of lavender and embers, the gentlest reminder of where they'd been and what they'd survived. For a while, neither man nor dog moved. They simply existed in the hush unique to places where justice had been restored, where hearts had been allowed to soften again. Finally, Raymond spoke, soft enough that only Max and, perhaps the valley, could hear. "Funny thing, Max," he murmured, his voice slipping into the rhythm of the wind. "We went looking for peace and found it in the ashes." Max lifted his head, opening one eye, as though answering without words. The dog shifted closer, laying his muzzle on Raymond's boot. Raymond reached down, hand resting on Max's collar, on the heat-warmed brass letters that caught the first glint of moonlight. The wind changed direction, carrying with it the scent of pine, damp earth, and something harder to name. Something like forgiveness. The fireflies brightened, drifting upward in slow spirals, mapping the air in small constellations that felt both fragile and eternal. And in that quiet, the valley breathed out, alive, redeemed, and warm again. Some stories don't end when the mission does. Some simply fold themselves into the quiet, into the breath you didn't know you were holding, into the kind of silence that feels less like emptiness and more like a place to rest. What happened here in Ember Creek will fade from the town's conversations long before it fades from the people who lived it. And maybe that's how it's meant to be. Because not every act of courage arrives with noise. Sometimes it walks on tired legs, or pads softly on four paws. Sometimes it looks like a man choosing gentleness over anger, or a dog standing guard even after the danger has passed. And sometimes it's just the simple truth that loyalty, kindness, and quiet strength still exist in this world, carried by those who expect no reward for giving everything they have. As the valley breathes easy again, maybe we're reminded that the bravest hearts aren't always the loudest. They're often the ones who stay when the fire dies down, who watch the horizon for us, who keep choosing the light even when no one is looking. And if tonight feels a little warmer, maybe it's because somewhere out there, someone like them is still standing watch. Or maybe, just maybe, you carry a piece of that courage in you too.